All right, so sometimes you just really want to get to the heart of something,
Yeah.
right? Like a big idea, without having to wade through, mountains of dense material.
Yeah.
That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive, taking these complex topics and hopefully making them click. So today we are looking at something really interesting and ultimately pretty critical, Nietzsche's take on Richard Wagner in his book, The Case of Wagner.
Yeah, this is gonna be good.
Yeah. So our listeners are smart. They want to know what's up. So we could break this down, this whole relationship, this tension between these two figures, and really get to what Nietzsche is trying to say
Yeah.
in a way that hopefully resonates with everybody. So to set this up a little bit so people can really understand this tension, it's important to know that Nietzsche and Wagner they were super tight at one point, like deeply connected, almost kindred spirits, you could say. And then something major shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And Nietzsche, right off the bat in the preface, he says, turning his back on Wagner felt like this huge, unavoidable thing, almost like destiny. And that finding joy in other things afterward, he really frames it like a personal victory.
Right.
So, just from that, you kind of get the sense that something really intense went down between them.
Yeah. And what I think is really insightful right off the bat is that he's elevating this break way beyond just a matter of taste. Oh, I just don't like his music anymore. He frames it as essential to his whole philosophical journey, to his growth. He talks about overcoming the spirit of his age within himself.
Oh, wow.
And aiming for something timeless, This battle against contemporary influences, it comes up a lot in his work. It was like a constant thing for him.
Yeah, for sure. And he doesn't shy away from, getting into He calls himself a decadent, just like he sees Wagner.
Right.
But here's the key difference. Nietzsche recognized this tendency in himself, this potential for decline, this being overly refined, this losing a certain vitality.
Mm-hmm.
And he fought against it, he says. And that's what sets him apart from Wagner in his mind. The philosopher within him was constantly pushing back.
And that's, if we think about decadence and how it relates to morality, for Nietzsche, our very notions of good and evil, they stem from this underlying issue of decadence,
Oh, yeah, okay, wow.
So if we kind of zoom out a little and look at, his broader philosophy, there's this really deep questioning of traditional morality. He thought about moral systems as often life-denying, as originating from a kind of weakness or a lack of robust life force. He called it the will to nonentity sometimes.
The will to nonentity. That's a really powerful phrase.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily this conscious desire for nothingness, but more like values that they diminish life's potential. You know, you're not living to your fullest.
Yeah. So this connects back to what you were saying earlier about Nietzsche feeling like he had to kind of distance himself from his own time. He needed to develop this self-discipline to even just begin to disagree with what everyone around him thought, just to be able to do his philosophical work. And so this split from Wagner, for him, it was part of that self-correction.
Yeah.
He literally says, seeing Wagner as belonging to the diseases that he was trying to overcome.
Wow.
That's pretty heavy.
It is. Yeah, it's a pretty strong way to put it. But, and this is also really important, he wasn't dismissing Wagner as irrelevant.
Okay.
Quite the opposite. He felt that a philosopher, someone who really wants to understand the world, had to engage with Wagner. He saw Wagner's work as this window into the modern spirit with all its, complexities, all the strengths, the weaknesses, all laid bare.
So it's almost like if you want to understand the modern age, you kind of have to understand Wagner.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
Because he embodies these contradictions.
And why Wagner? Why of all people? It seems like Nietzsche believed that Wagner, through his art, through his persona, just so perfectly captured the essence of their time, the good and the bad, that he basically became this unavoidable case study. He forces us to confront the underlying spirit of the era, like it or not.
Okay, so we've got this really intense, critical perspective on Wagner. And then, almost out of nowhere, Nietzsche starts talking about this other composer, Bizet.
Right.
Specifically, his opera, Carmen.
Yeah.
And the way he talks about it, it's totally different. He's heard it dozens of times. It resonates with him deeply and makes him feel complete.
Yeah.
It's like a complete 180 from how he's talking about Wagner.
And it's interesting what he specifically admires about Bizet. He uses these words like lightness, grace, style, and even lovability.
Okay.
He had this idea that all that is good is easy, everything divine runs with light feet, and he saw Bizet's music as embodying that perfectly.
It's really interesting.
There's no forced drama, no heavy emotion.
Right, right. And here he really takes a dig at Wagner's music, right? He calls his orchestration brutal, artificial, and unsophisticated. He even says it's like being hit by this hot wind, a sore rocco.
Wow.
Yeah. And he even says it makes him feel unpleasant physically. It's like, the contrast with how he talks about Bizet couldn't be more stark.
Yeah, and Nietzsche, he really emphasizes how Carmen, he says it's wicked, refined, fatalistic, but it's still genuinely popular. He talks about its clarity, its sense of completion, and he contrasts that directly with Wagner's endless melody,
Okay.
That to him just felt bloated, unhealthy.
Yeah, yeah. And what's so interesting, for me at least, is that it's not just about musical preference for Nietzsche. He actually says listening to Carmen makes him a better philosopher.
What?
Yeah, he's like, it makes him more patient, happier. He even says more Indian, whatever that means,
Mm-hmm.
more grounded, more in touch with certain things. He really felt that music could like emancipate the spirit and give wings to thought. And that Bizet's music specifically just sparked his own creativity.
That's wild. That link between art and especially music and philosophical insight is so important for Nietzsche.
Right.
He talks about experiencing this like philosophical passion with Bizet, this like state of mind that just opens up new perspectives and helps him solve problems. Like the music just clears away, mental clutter.
And he also sees Carmen like representing this return to nature, health, good spirits, youth, virtue.
Oh, wow.
Which is the complete opposite to that damp north that he associates with Wagner's world. And, he praises this different kind of sensuality in Carmen, right? The liveliness, the cheerfulness. And he describes it as having this really interesting African and fatalistic quality.
And, he even goes into how love is portrayed. Right?
Yeah.
He sees love in Carmen as this force of fate.
Mm-hmm.
Cynical, innocent, cruel, and ultimately this fundamental mortal hatred between the sexes.
Wow.
And he really contrasts that with, what he saw as Wagner's often very sentimental and possessive view of love. For Nietzsche, Carmen captured something more raw and maybe even in a way more honest about, human relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And he even comes up with this great line, il faut méditerraniser la musique. Music needs to become more Mediterranean.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not just about the geography, obviously, right?
Right.
It's this whole idea of clarity, this artistic health, a naturalism that he felt was completely missing in Wagner's, intense brooding style.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's kind of set up this Bizet as this contrasting ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he really starts to dissect Wagner's operas and the themes that he sees running through them. And one of the big ones is this whole idea of salvation.
Yes, and what I find really fascinating is Nietzsche's almost like mocking take on these salvation narratives.
Right.
He goes through a bunch of Wagner's most famous operas, Tannhauser, The Flying Dutchman, Lohengrin, even The Ring, and he gives these super sharp, almost sarcastic summaries of like, who needs saving and how they supposedly achieve it.
It's so funny the way he does it.
It's great.
Yeah, he's basically poking fun at this whole idea of like these flawed characters finding redemption through these really simple, almost unbelievable means, right? Like, a knight who's like a total sinner being saved by like a pure maiden, or the wandering Jew finding peace through marriage.
Mm-hmm.
He's clearly seeing these resolutions as simplistic, maybe even a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. And, he specifically calls out the element of unquestioning faith in Lohengrin.
Oh, yeah.
Where the hero forbids any inquiries into his origins, his background. Nietzsche was so critical of blind faith in general. And so for him, this was just, a really problematic aspect of Wagner's storytelling. Okay. And he linked it to like religious dogma.
Right.
He also questioned the idea in The Flying Dutchman, where it's, this woman's devotion can redeem even the most troubled man. And he asks, is this even desirable?
Oh, interesting.
What does that even mean? And he ties this back to his broader views on artists, and their relationship to often women who are their muses.
Right.
And he suggests that this dependence on adoration, this kind of, being put on a pedestal, especially by women, it can actually be bad for the artist, that it can be this kind of like refined parasitism.
Oh, wow.
He even brings up how how Goethe was received in Germany and how Wagner was, putting forth this way to save Goethe's legacy, but in a way that fit with like societal expectations.
Right. Yeah.
And, Nietzsche just found that so ironic.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting if you think about Goethe's own words about the dangers of romanticism and how it can get bogged down in all this moralizing and religious, stuff. It really helps us understand how Nietzsche was coming at Parsifal and his view of holiness as something that, philosophers just fundamentally misunderstand.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's seeing these themes of salvation in Wagner as, rooted in this kind of this life-denying perspective. It's another symptom of the decadence that they're talking about.
Exactly.
So then Nietzsche gets into the Ring Cycle.
Right.
Which is like Wagner's massive, 4-opera epic. And initially he saw it as this potentially revolutionary work, like embodying this rebellion against, all the old rules and norms, morality, tradition, all that stuff. And all of that's embodied in the character of Siegfried. He even talks about Siegfried's unconventional origins, right? Coming from adultery, almost like a deliberate middle finger to traditional morality.
Right.
Yeah. And what's cool is you can really sense Nietzsche's initial enthusiasm for this rebellious spirit in the ring. He sees Siegfried's disrespect for the old ways, his quest to emancipate woman by freeing Brunhilde.
And he sees all this as this really promising sign, like hinting at this future of greater freedom, a collapse of all these outdated moral systems.
It's almost like he's rooting for it. But then, according to Nietzsche, everything goes wrong.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He says Wagner's ship, his artistic vision, basically like crashes on the rocks of Schopenhauer's philosophy.
Oh, that's rough.
Yeah. And he feels that Wagner became like ashamed of his earlier, more optimistic vision, and he reinterpreted the Ring through this much more pessimistic Schopenhauerian lens, where ultimately everything falls apart and the only solace is non-existence.
Oh, wow. And this shift is really central to Nietzsche's whole critique of Wagner, right? He sees Brunhilde's revised role, where she's studying Schopenhauer.
Oh, yeah.
And this is like this clear indication that Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, really, influenced and maybe even corrupted the artist of what Nietzsche saw as decadence. So the initial, revolutionary potential of the Ring, in Nietzsche's mind, it's totally undermined by this philosophy that to him was just so life-denying.
Okay, and this all leads to, I think, Nietzsche's most damning statement, right?
Yeah.
He calls Wagner the artist of decadence. And he doesn't mean this lightly at all.
Right.
He sees Wagner as someone who fundamentally weakens and corrupts art itself, makes music sick. He calls him a typical decadent who tries to pass off his own degraded tastes as something, progressive or somehow superior.
And what's really striking here for me is just the force of his language.
Right.
It's really intense. He sees Wagner as having this almost irresistible power of seduction,
Yeah.
And he's deeply concerned by the lack of resistance to this. To him, it's a symptom of a broader cultural decline, a weakening of these fundamental, almost instinctive reactions that we should have.
And he makes this really interesting comparison. He says it's like people who are already exhausted being drawn to things that are harmful. Imagine a vegetarian suddenly craving the unhealthiest food you can think of.
Oh, yeah, I get it.
Right. And his point is that Wagner's art is fundamentally unhealthy. It's filled with this excess emotion, instability, morbid characters. It's almost like he compares it to a hospital ward.
Wow.
Yeah. Full of artistic ailments.
And he even goes so far as to call him, a nevrose, a neurosis.
Yeah.
And the perfect case study for doctors, psychologists. He saw Wagner as embodying the extreme irritability, the unhealthy sensitivity of the modern age. In a way, he's saying Wagner is a quintessential modern artist.
And even a charlatan, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he calls him the Cagliostro of modernity. This figure who's mixing genuine talent with theatrical trickery and even a touch of simple-mindedness. Right?
Yeah.
And Nietzsche, he accuses Wagner of corrupting music, at its core.
Right.
By using it to overstimulate these already tired nerves, making the art form itself ill. And he acknowledges that, Wagner has this ability to excite those jaded sensibilities, and he's a master of theatrical illusion. But he sees this success, particularly with these audiences who are seeking, intense, often like overwrought emotions, he sees it as leading other musicians down a really dangerous path.
Yeah.
Where only this unhealthy music is what becomes successful,
Mm.
commercially.
And that paints a really kind of bleak picture of the music world as Nietzsche saw it. You
Right.
know, like genuine artistic integrity was being sacrificed for sensationalism and this exploitation of, people's already kind of weakened emotional states.
Yeah, yeah. And then Nietzsche turns to Wagner's own writings, the things he wrote about music.
Mm-hmm.
And what he sees as this fundamental lack of like genuine artistic form in his work.
Yeah.
He even imagines Wagner advising young artists to deliberately compose badly.
What?
Yeah, like in
Yeah.
order to achieve fame and fortune, to
Yes.
prioritize grandiosity and mass appeal over actual artistic merit.
Mm.
And what's really insightful here is Nietzsche's analysis of Wagner's artistic priorities.
Yeah.
He argues that Wagner's style, so-called, actually focuses on the emotional state before thought.
Oh, interesting.
Those basic elements like sound and spectacle, but he's neglecting melody.
Yeah.
And he even says melody is immoral for Wagner.
Yeah.
He uses Parsifal as like the prime example.
Okay. Yeah.
And he describes Wagner's like emotional expression as almost grotesque and artificial, like this deliberate use of jarring harmonies, but is presented as being more natural.
Yeah.
And all this, while ironically urging artists to be idealists, to rely on these superficial emotional appeals.
Right. Right.
And he sees this as like a rejection of genuine musical pleasure.
Yeah.
Like dismissing it as belonging to like a more balanced era.
Mm-hmm.
And advocating for this like dramatic posturing, this affected seriousness, under the guise of this higher purpose, like, saving humanity through my music.
It's and it's this fear that Nietzsche has for the future of art.
Right.
The artist becoming a mere actor, art becoming this form of elaborate deception.
And he views this shift towards theatricality as a symptom of this deeper like physiological decline. He specifically says hysteria.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And he even extends this critique to Wagner's writing style. Like his actual prose, he sees it as mirroring the flaws in his music. He says in decadent art, the parts, they become more important than the whole. You get this kind of like artistic anarchy, this weakening of like the overall coherence.
Yeah. And specifically with Wagner, Nietzsche thinks that like the focus on these intense emotional states, that comes first. And then the music is just used as this like sign language.
Interesting.
Yeah, to express those feelings that have already been decided. And he, while he acknowledges that Wagner's really good at those small details, calling him, a master of the miniature, he criticizes his attempts to make bigger structures, to develop larger musical forms.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it just comes off as weak and amateurish.
And he concludes that, Wagner essentially faked this coherent, dramatic style to cover up the fact that he couldn't create these organic forms. And he criticizes the popular elements of Wagner's art as just being in bad taste, fundamentally. He points to specific examples, Tannhauser Overture. He talks about Walkery Circus, Lohengrin Prelude.
Okay.
But he does say, look, there's another Wagner, the composer of these melancholic, smaller pieces, these little treasures. But ultimately, he suggests that, Wagner's defining characteristic as a decadent artist, it's his capacity for pity.
Okay, so that kind of brings up the question, right, of
Yeah.
like how is it that Wagner's influence can be so pervasive?
Right.
Like even affecting people who aren't like deeply, musically knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche argues it's because Wagner was a phenomenal actor. Like he could just overwhelm audiences with this sheer emotional force.
And he sees Wagner, the actor, as this kind of tyrant,
Okay.
whose intense displays just crush any resistance. Like you don't have a choice but to submit.
Oh, wow.
And he argues that Wagner prioritizes these overwhelming emotions above all else, and he creates this really drawn out, almost suffocating intensity, and this leads Nietzsche to even question whether Wagner was even really a musician at all. Suggesting that he was more accurately this incomparable histrio, this theatrical genius.
Yeah.
And he really wants to put Wagner outside the true lineage of musical history.
Right.
Like warning us not to compare him to figures like Beethoven, which is almost sacrilegious in his mind.
Right.
And he believes that Wagner became a musician and poet only because his like tyrannical theatrical instincts, they drove him in that direction, not out of any natural musical inclination.
Yeah. And he says this so strongly that Wagner was not instinctively a musician.
Right.
And he points to the fact that, Wagner was willing to disregard all the rules, the traditional forms,
Yeah.
just to create this more, rhetorical language for the stage.
Right.
But, he does give him credit.
Yeah.
For expanding kind of the expressive possibilities of music in relation to drama.
Right.
He even calls him, the Victor Hugo of music,
Yeah.
but only in the sense of music becoming speech, not like its own art.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately, Nietzsche declares that Wagner's music outside of, that theatrical world is simply bad music.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he even jokes that, like, when a musician can no longer count to 3, he becomes dramatic and Wagnerian.
Okay, that's funny.
Yeah.
But, despite this, this really harsh judgment, Nietzsche does acknowledge that Wagner almost accidentally discovered this power of raw, elementary musical effect that's purely driven by its impact on the audience.
Right.
He compares Wagner's unwavering focus on effect to playwrights like Schiller.
Right.
And he highlights the actor's principle, what appears true to the audience doesn't have to be true.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he applies that to Wagner's music.
Right.
It's never really true.
Yeah. And he makes this interesting contrast between how Wagner was perceived in his youth, as this rich, generous figure,
Yeah.
versus this later realization that his music was actually pretty thin in terms of substance. And he criticizes his recitatives as weak, and even his famous leitmotifs is just these ideal toothpicks, insubstantial, not nourishing.
Just for show.
Yeah.
And that really reinforces his core argument, I think, that Wagner's primary focus was on theatrical impact and manipulating the audience's emotions, often at the expense of genuine musical integrity.
Okay, so then he turns to Wagner's approach to drama itself. And his librettos, the text of the operas. And he argues that even when he's just sketching out the action, Wagner is first and foremost an actor, thinking in terms of powerful scenes, these big, emotional displays. And he's specifically catering to the tastes of the 19th century audience.
Right, yeah. And he criticizes his tendency to prioritize the final emotional impact over logic, over coherence.
Right.
He thinks that Wagner puts minimal effort into crafting believable plots and resolutions. He says his storylines would fall apart under close scrutiny. And he even says, look, Wagner wasn't a true dramatist. He just loved the word drama.
Oh, wow.
And that's reflected in his writing.
Right.
He just didn't have the psychological depth for real drama.
Yeah.
He substitutes superficial eccentricities.
Yeah.
And he uses this example of needing a female voice, which leads to the somewhat contrived appearance of Erda and Siegfried, just to sing, briefly and then disappear.
Yeah.
And then he questions the actual substance of his dramatic text. What is it really about?
Right.
And he proposes this thought experiment. What if you translated these epic tales into a modern everyday setting?
Oh, wow.
He finds it entertaining to imagine Parsifal as a divinity student.
Right.
Just a normal guy.
Stripped of all the grandeur.
Yeah. And he highlights the absurdity of these heroic figures when you take away all the mythological trappings.
Yeah.
And then he makes this really surprising comparison. He suggests that Wagner's heroines, once you remove all the heroic trappings, they're basically like Madame Bovary.
Really?
This character who's known for her, romantic delusions, her dissatisfaction. And he argues that Wagner was really interested in the problems of these Parisian decadents, always near the hospital, always focused on these big city issues.
Right. And he points out, there's this notable absence of children among his, female characters.
Right.
And he says the way that Wagner describes Siegfried's birth is almost tortured, and it reveals his modern sensibilities. Yeah. And then he concludes with this really shocking statement. He claims that Parsifal is actually Lohengrin's father. Yeah. And he sarcastically asks, does chastity work miracles? And he throws in this Latin quote, Wagnerus dixit princeps in castitate auctoritas. Huh. Which basically translates to Wagner, the authority on chastity, has spoken.
Oh, that's so cutting.
Yeah. So then he moves on to Wagner's writings. It's
Mhm.
this huge body of essays and theoretical work, and he views them as this kind of like school of shrewdness,
Mm.
offering this practical advice on how to achieve success, often through not so honest means.
Right, right.
And he distills Wagner's approach down to these three kind of cynical propositions.
Okay.
So proposition one, everything that Wagner cannot do is bad.
Oh, okay.
And he attributes this to supposed like unwavering principles, right?
Yeah.
Number two, everything that Wagner can do, no one will ever be able to do after him.
Wow.
Like he's this uniquely gifted, almost godlike figure. And then the third one, he just throws it in there so sarcastically. He says, these two ideas are the core of Wagner's writing. The rest is merely literature.
Ouch.
Yeah. And then he goes on to ask, like why did Wagner's music need all this text, all this explanation?
Yeah, yeah.
And he suggests it wasn't because the music was so profound or difficult to understand, but like maybe the opposite.
Interesting.
And he notes how Wagner was always saying it, my music, it means something more than just music.
Right.
Yeah. And Nietzsche argues that Wagner's compositional style, which relied on, these little short recurring musical ideas and these motives,
Yeah.
instead of creating these larger structures, it forced him to constantly be explaining what those motives represented.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he summarizes Wagner's theory and practice as this.